Hi, everybody. Our panel today is the Holy Grail or Pipe Dream, paying for performance to achieve social impact and equity. And I know there are a lot of experts in the audience. We have a lot of experts on the panel, so I really hope we'll have a robust discussion. We're going to leave about 15 minutes at least for a Q&A. So the general framework that we want to try to set the stage for is to talk about the history of social impact investing, to talk about the roles of the key parties, and we have someone representing each of the different sides up here almost. We're missing one of our panelists today. And really to think about how pay for performance can support FACT's mission and the mission of so many of us in the room of social and economic justice. And we'll also talk about the challenges and opportunities of implementing pay for performance, because it isn't a simple thing, but it is an exciting thing with a lot of potential. So I've been asked not to spend too much time on the bios. It's hard, it's a very accomplished group. You have them in your packages, but I'm going to describe kind of the angle from which they're going to be speaking today. And so the person that we're missing is Lili-An. Lili was going to be the service provider on the panel. She's from ROCA, a Massachusetts-based organization that is doing its first Pay for Success project, the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Pay for Success project. However, other panelists here are involved with it as well. So we're going to channel Lili, even though she can't be here in person. Right to my right, we have Kristin Giantris. Kristin is from the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and she represents the capacity builder and the intermediary perspective. Kristin is a managing director at NFF, and NFF is truly a leader of capacity building for nonprofits in the sector, as well as an intermediator of capital. And as part of this effort, NFF has developed a practice around social impact investing that includes technical assistance, a learning hub website, grants, which I'm pleased to thank you for. Enterprise is a recipient of a grant for a social impact bond in Denver, as well as financing. And the Nonprofit Finance Fund is one of the TA providers on the Change Capital Fund, which you're going to be hearing about today. FAC is a recipient of it, and FAC is honoring the Change Capital Fund tonight. And then to one further over, to give a wave, is Andy Phillips. Andy is the vice president in Goldman Sachs' Urban Investment Group. And she leads the social impact work, and she led the first SIB in the United States for Rikers Island here in New York, and has done 3 subsequent transactions, one in Utah and one in Chicago, focused on early childhood education, and one in Massachusetts on recidivism, which is, I believe, the Lili-An project. Okay. And then from the government perspective, we have Matt Klein, third over, and Matt is representing New York City. He is the executive director for the Center for Economic Opportunity and the senior advisor for social innovation in the Mayor's Office of Operations. And he's really developing citywide measures for opportunity and equality, bringing effective anti-poverty approaches to scale, and using data to enhance delivery of social services. And finally, we have David Greenberg of MDRC, who's a researcher and a practitioner focused on community development, community organizing, and the urban movement. David's involved in evaluating flagship programs, including the Change Capital Fund. So to kick us off, Kristin, it'd be terrific if you could describe pay for performance and really the roles of all of the key players in this type of transaction.
Okay, in 3 minutes. In time.
Short straw.
I did. I definitely drew the short straw on this. It's ill-defined, so I'm going to get to define it, and then you all can argue with me or support me and where we come out. Very simply, the way I and NFF would define pay for performance today, standing in sort of our current context, is the ability to measure the impact of an intervention or a program that is being implemented. And the difference, I think, in the conversation today is that measurement of impact is based upon outcomes and not upon outputs. And I think there's been a long history, obviously already standing around, of pay for performance contracts from through the government in various locations. But that is decidedly different, I think, than our conversation today, in the fact that we're talking about how do you how do you measure your intervention around outcomes? And then if you want to carry that forward, and why does that sort of become even more meaningful in today's conversation, I think the reason it does is because we're putting we're raising the bar on how to define those outcomes, because we are attaching an economic value to them, and then we're monetizing them. We're figuring out, well, how do you value that outcome? What kind of dollar you put against that outcome, and then how are you going to get paid on that outcome? That is really a very different conversation than I think any of us have been having over many decades, because in fact we've been talking about outcomes for decades in various parts of our work, but we've never actually put that economic value and tried to monetize that in transactions. And therefore, what's sort of popping up is a very new relationship between government, service provider, and investor, with a whole new set of incentives around the table because of that valuation and monetization. Shall I pause there?
Thank you. So I actually have, for my own personal curiosity, I mean, I think we hear about this thing called many different things. We hear about it called social impact investing. We hear about it called a SIB, pay for performance, pay for success. Is there a difference? Is it all the same thing?
I will say I think that depends on who you talk to a little bit, and I think I think there is a difference, and that the difference, the definition of that difference is an evolving one. What I would call out is that I think we need to start getting clear between terminology that defines the type of contract relationship and contract one is entering into, and the core elements of that contract, versus the financing structure you're using to support that contract. And I don't know if others on the panel would agree, but I think there's a real difference between structuring a pay for performance or even pay for success contract versus a social impact bond financing vehicle.
More. I will just add to that. Hi, everybody. Andy Phillips from the Urban Investment Group. Just before I jump into answering that question, we're an impact investing team at Goldman. We have the lion's share of that portfolio really focuses on rebuilding the bricks and mortar of communities across the U.S. My lovely colleague John Olson is also here to give a shout out. And we got involved in financing what we would call what have been called social impact bonds, even though I have tried to get them to be called social impact bonds, because they are not. That has not stuck. Apparently, I have no future in communications.
Branding's not your thing.
It's just not my thing, so that's not happening. Hopefully, I have other skills and talents. Just to build on what Kristin was saying, I think we really think about this as two separate things happening at the same time. One is this trend towards pay for success and pay for outcomes, however you want to describe it, which in our mind is really about government doing business differently. I was at a conference last week where I have my new favorite statistic, that apparently the US government sort of collectively, sort of state and local as well, spend $2.5 trillion a year on human services. Sort of a staggering amount. The lion's share of that money has always been contracted out on a cost reimbursement basis, which means organizations may talk about goals, they may talk about outputs, but the financial structure of those contracts is we will agree on a budget up front, you will spend that money, and we will reimburse what you spend. That's not a great way to do business. Most people would not renovate their kitchen, buy any other product based on that contracting structure. So what we think is very exciting about the pay for success, pay for outcome movement is that it really is about government doing business differently, and instead of reimbursing expenses, they are paying for the outcomes that they want. So that they may use that structure to buy widgets, or they may use that structure to buy kids who are on track and on grade level in school, like they decided to do in Utah. And so we think that's exciting. There is nothing about that contracting structure that requires private capital. The role that private capital can play that we also think is pretty exciting is to basically finance that risk and finance the timing disconnect between when those outcomes are achieved and when those services are delivered. Nonprofits or service providers with balance sheets could self-finance those contracts. Where the private sector can be effective is coming in to take on that risk when the other parties aren't in a position to do that. So I think we would see it from Goldman's perspective in a very similar way.
Thanks. It's very helpful, and I think it kind of leads to the next question, which is, how has this work evolved? It started in England. You brought it to the U.S. at Goldman. How has it evolved, and where do you see it going?
So a little bit of the story behind how we got involved in this, and I would not credit us with bringing it to the U.S. So
Okay.
I think I would credit former Deputy Mayor Linda Gibbs with that. Which was really that she was in a position, and I think this speaks to how she really approached her portfolio in New York City government, which was being very focused on data. And her team had been looking at outcomes for young men of color in New York City, and were really concerned about the outcomes that those young men were achieving, the life outcomes versus their white counterparts, and became very focused on how to address that equity issue, for lack of a better way to describe it, or social justice issue. And in doing her homework around the data, they began looking at the disproportionate number of young men of color who end up incarcerated on Rikers Island. What folks may not know is that New York State and North Carolina are the only two states in the country who incarcerate juveniles in adult facilities. Not something we should all be proud of as residents of New York State, but it is true, and it is not a city law. It's a state law. I think the city probably shares our view on that. So they began to look at sort of what was happening for young men on Rikers, and they very quickly looked at the recidivism rates, which were 50% in 1 year. At the same time that they were looking at these issues, what they were also going through was across-the-board budget cuts. And she was faced with the issue of, how do I address what I see as a really pressing policy priority in a time when I have less money to spend? Even though if I do the math and I can reduce recidivism among young men on Rikers, I will save money in the long run. The problem is today I have no money to actually put into those programs. And she became very intrigued with the idea of the social impact bond that got launched in the UK, and called us up and said, what do you think about this idea? And because of the work Goldman does investing in double bottom line investments, or investments where there is an intentional social impact, it made sense to us to look at this like we'd look at any other deal, which is, do we think do we think it's going to have the social impact that we are looking for, and do we think it is an investable opportunity? Those conversations went on for a long time because these are very different than any investment we had ever made, but ultimately we were able to get comfortable with the risk as well as the potential return for that investment, and have been very pleased that this idea has really captured the imagination, I would say, nationally. Right now, there is bipartisan legislation in the House and the Senate to support federal dollars, helping instigate and facilitate deals on the ground. The White House Office of Social Innovation also launched $13 million in technical assistance contracts to wonderful groups like NFF to help state and local governments execute on these transactions. And so there's lots of interest happening nationally, which we think is exciting, not just from the investment perspective, but also as part of this new movement towards evidence-based policy. And how does government contract in a way that is more effective and drives to results?
Thanks. So one of the things that has really jumped out of this conversation is measurement and the data driven, and I wanted to kind of ask you, Matt, what is the de Blasio administration thinking about? Because we've heard that there's a difference. There's both the contract and the payment style for government as well as the financing structure. And where is the de Blasio administration coming out on this? Is it something that they're looking at, pursuing? I know you look at data in your work. How does that interplay with it?
Yep. So a couple of points. First, thanks for being here. Longtime fan of FAC, so to be able to participate in something that celebrates FAC is a pleasure and an honor, especially for a Brooklyn resident. So thank you. A few points. I mean, I think I would echo Kristin and Andy in saying that the notion of the deal, the structure of a deal, is only one part of the benefits of a pay-for-performance kind of approach. And so I think we continue to carry forward the social impact bond that Deputy Mayor Gibbs launched and are proud to continue to support that. And we're entering into upcoming exciting time where we're starting to begin to see what the results will be over the next several months. So that's an important milestone, and we continue to that. I think we're definitely, as an administration, open to more social impact bond contracting structures, but we're also, I think, very much supportive of the underlying principles of evidence-driven policy, rigorous performance management, paying for things that will work, and doing that not necessarily attached to a social impact bond or a pay-for-performance contracting structure, but doing it through the policies and practices that our agencies and human service agencies and workforce agencies pursue generally. So, we're looking at data from a range of different ways. The portfolio that I oversee also owes its existence to Deputy Mayor Gibbs. She helped create the Center for Economic Opportunity. She helped create two other units that real nonprofit-y, wonky types know about, which is the HHS Accelerator and HHS Connect, which utilizes data from across agencies to help the city work more holistically with individual clients. And so these are efforts that are fully embraced now, are being integrated across the board at the city level. And those units, which were launched under Linda Gibbs, are now in the Office of Operations, which is the place where the mayor's management report and other kind of policies and performance measures are tracked. So we're all on board on pay for performance generally, but even more so on applying the principles generally in our policymaking.
Thanks. And David, kind of taking it to a more granular level, you are one of the TA providers for the Change Capital Fund. There are 5 nonprofits who are grantees, including the Fifth Avenue Committee, and many of them are really looking at outcomes-driven work. Are any of them considering pay for performance? As a researcher, how are you advising them on that?
Right. So we actually have 2 types. MDRC has 2 types of experiences with impact investing, and maybe reflect a little bit about both of them. So for those of you who don't know, MDRC is a 40-year-old social policy research organization that's dedicated to learning what works to improve the lives of low-income people. And we actually have had the pleasure of partnering, I think, with just about everybody on the panel on the New York City Social Investment Bond at Rikers Island. We're actually, we're typically in an evaluation role, but for this project, the evaluation lens is turned on to us, and we are very much looking forward to seeing what happens in that situation. So my colleagues have identified 2 major challenges that really come up in preparing for impact investment to work. And the first is really finding the right type of program model. So in order to be sure that we're operating something that truly can deliver cost savings to government and to the people and to improve the lives of the targeted population, it's important to have the most rigorously evaluated framework that we know will work, that will result in cost savings. But just because you have some evidence of strong impacts in one area doesn't mean that that model is always transferable into a new system and that it can be scaled up appropriately. And so understanding the right type of match between whatever the intervention is and the new system in which it's operated. So taking, for example, in the Rikers project, a cognitive behavioral intervention and really making it work within the justice system is the challenge, and you have to really pay attention to make sure that it's operating successfully. And the second issue relates to finding the right type of evaluation framework. So there are some nuance of jargon here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of focusing on program impacts for expectations. Other people will call it outcomes, but in our jargon we talk about impacts. And it's important for a number of reasons. So one is that and there are pay for performance contracts that are out there, as my panelists fellow panelists have described. But sometimes they can place emphasis on things that, frankly, can be misleading at best or counterproductive at worst. And I'll use the example of a sort of a welfare to work job training program, for example. So if you pay providers to place people in jobs and count that as what counts and what you pay for, that's certainly important and much more important than process type inputs or outputs. But it can also potentially result in creaming on the part of service provision to find those who are really most likely to find work and would have done so anyway. And the work of FAC and other driven community organizations really is to go above and beyond, and people who participate in a real impact evaluation in a social investment framework are committed to doing more than what would have otherwise happened. They're committed to working with the, exceptionally advantaged participant to do more than what that person would have done seeking work otherwise. And they're committed to working with a very difficult participant who has multiple barriers to make sure that there is that they're nudging them in the right direction, and that's where the impacts can be found. So, operation and finding the evaluation framework are the important things. And as it relates to change capital, these are 5 groups. It's still in the early phases of the initiative, and FAC and other implementers can talk about their interests, but all of them have promising evidence-based models that they're looking toward finding some consistent revenue streams for, and certainly this is one of them.
Thank you. I think kind of having that framework is really helpful for understanding what some of the challenges are. And I'd like to take this moment for Andy to channel Lili Elkins and talk about, Lili is our panelist for those who walked in, representing one of the service providers. She's not here today, but to talk about from a service provider's perspective, a pay for performance project, pay for success project that's in the making and that's working. This is a Massachusetts juvenile justice pay for success project.
So, if folks have met Lili, she's big shoes to fill, even though she's actually not a very large human being, and really, really fabulous at what she does. I'm going to take a slightly different take on this, to say, as an investor, why we were so pleased that ROCA was the service provider. I think as a way of sort of thinking about what does a service provider need. So for us, looking at this as an investment, and while we are sort of always looking for the social impact, we are also looking for strong investments. And what any investor will tell you, whether it's corporate or real estate or whatever you're investing in, the management team is critically important. When you're talking about one of these social impact bond investments, it's also incredibly important. And one of the things that is so impressive about ROCA, and Lili is a key part of that management team, is their management team. Both their subject matter expertise and depth of experience in working with at-risk youth, as well as their performance management system. And so I think for them coming into this transaction, one of the things that was very appealing to them as a service provider is they are serving the hardest to serve. I would be not be doing them justice if I didn't talk about what they call relentless outreach / stalking, which is rather than sitting at their program and waiting for the motivated young people to come in, they actually go out in these white vans and they go find the young people. And if you actually talk about the young people who are in their program, they'll say, oh yeah, they used to come to my house. They used to bang on the door and wake me up. They go out and find those young people that are the most at risk, who are, as Molly, who is the founder of the organization, says, they are not ready, willing, and able. The last thing they want is help. The last thing they want us to do is make changes in their lives. And oftentimes it takes a ROCA youth worker 6 months to engage one of these young men because they're out there constantly saying to them, do something differently, banging on the door. They'll talk about how I banged on the door for 3 weeks in a row, and when they came out and shouted at me and you can imagine what the young person said, we'll leave that to you. We thought that was progress because they actually opened the door, and I thought, wow, you folks are committed. And so I think for Molly and Lily and their team, what was attractive about this financing mechanism is they have been collecting data for years, and they believe in their program, and they know it works. And so the notion that what they can do is serve more young men, which is what they want to do, and and have a stream of funding available to them that will enable them to serve more young men, that's incredibly appealing. What they also did in the transaction is they retained some of the risk. So the loans that fund the program, the investments, fund the day-to-day operations. We fund those, both the Goldman senior capital and the other subordinate lenders and grant makers in the deal. We only pay them 85% of their costs, with the notion that they're retaining 15% risk. They also earn an upside on that, and I've spent enough time working in nonprofits to know that any upside and money you can bring in that is not tied to a particular project has about 10 times its dollar value to you because you can use it for what you need, which is great for them as an organization. For us as an investor, it means we are all aligned around the same goal, which is reducing recidivism and increasing employment amongst those young men. The other interesting thing about them and their focus on performance management, because we are an investor in this deal, we also talk about when is it time to exit. When is it time to say the data shows us that this program isn't working? So we as investors are not going to continue to invest, and what we will do is do a mindful shutdown. That doesn't mean we come in and we lock the doors of ROCA and young people are like, wait, what happened? That means a negotiated structure where it's 6 months to help find these young men other services. As we were negotiating this with all the parties, one of the things that for us so spoke to ROCA's commitment to both their social impact as well as strong management was they were right there with us. They said, if this program isn't working, we're doing these kids a disservice. We need to find the program that works for them rather than trying to do the same thing that we know isn't working. And so I would say, sort of to wrap that up, you need strong performance management to be able to engage in this. You need data that shows you have a track record of achieving the outcomes. We feel that these structures work best to scale a program rather than start something totally new. Did I channel Lily?
Well, you channeled yourself even, which was great, because I think what the investor's perspective is really valuable. And Kristin, I'd like to ask you, as sort of a consultant and a TA provider, if a group comes to you and they say, we have the management team, we have the performance management, we've got a program that we think works, we really want to scale it, and we want that upside, we want that liquid gold of nonprofits that is the sort of flexible capital. What else do they need to know? What type of homework do you give them? What does their board need to know? What does the staff need to be doing?
Sure. So I want to channel Lily a little bit later. Can I do that? But I'll answer the question first. We actually think about it in pretty clear terms, and we define it as 4 elements of capital: intellectual capital, financial capital, social capital, and human capital. And I think it's 4 pieces of a pie. I think for most organizations starting down the path of this work, the biggest piece of the pie is the intellectual capital, and what we're talking about there is exactly what Andy was stressing, and that is, what do you have in terms of data today? How long have you been collecting it? How reliable is it? What does it measure, and what does the measurement say about the impact? And that's a really big slice of the pie for almost any organization doing its work. Roca had been doing that for 10 plus years before they came to the table on the transaction, and it took them 2+ years to get the deal done. They had done a lot of the work with the data, and they had, quote unquote, sold their outcomes already. So they had lived, to a degree, the experience of providing enough evidence to their investors, or I should say at that time, their funders, that that in certain cases, funders were buying outcomes. So the intellectual capital piece is significant. But the other pieces are as important. And so when we think about, once you've kind of identified that or covered that intellectual piece, we've identified the intervention, we know how we measure it, we have the evidence, and we know how to go on, and we know the data we need to collect. Then the question becomes, okay, well then what is the financial implication of all of that? So what is the full cost structure for delivering that intervention in the way that it meets your goal of delivering those outcomes? Beyond the cost structure of that program, what are the financial implications for your entire enterprise? Because now I imagine if you have strong measurement, you probably have strong systems. Your staff is now working in a different way. So what's the human capital piece look like for you? Do you have the right capacities in the right places? And are those capacities organized and working together in the way that allows you to maximize that system around delivering service, measuring, collecting and measuring data, and delivering outcomes? And then finally, and I think this is true among our change capital organizations and others, and that is that social capital piece. Because in many ways, and I think Michelle can even speak to this, maybe we'll do so later, it's often more than a single organization that we're talking about who's trying to achieve an outcome. And what it means to not just sort of be nice to each other side by side, but truly agree that at the heart of it, we are all striving for the same outcomes, and we will coordinate what our interventions are accordingly, and we will live and die by basically that sort of construct and contract. That takes a lot of social capital just on the delivery side, not to mention all the other stakeholders around the table that you have to be able to negotiate with. So it's a high bar, and I don't think it's not a high bar because it's not a desirable place to be, and so we want to dissuade people. It's a high bar because at NFF, one of our main priorities is the health of a nonprofit provider and their ability to continue to deliver in their communities. What's the risk one is taking to be able to participate under this kind of a contract and construct? And I'll be honest, the majority of providers, because we work with hundreds of them across the country, are not in the same position Roca was when they came to the table on this. And what we need is a much larger and better supported on-ramp for those organizations to come up on these sort of 4 pieces of capital to be able to participate.
So what I'm hearing is that even for the most kind of sophisticated, far-along organization, it still takes 2 years. And so this may be your chance to channel Lily. If Lily were here, would she be saying the words that those teenagers did when they opened the door, or would she be saying something else?
She would say a couple of things, I think. One thing she would say is, it is those 2 years were expensive and trying and costly, let's say, like on their human capital, for example, to be able to participate. That asked a lot of their institution to be able to be there. I think we should also be clear that that's in terms of a transaction, a standalone transaction. If we want to broaden this conversation, I don't know if we do, Judy, but I'm going to try it for a second. If we want to broaden this conversation and say, well, what happens when we're just going to change the relationship between provider and government agency? What if the construct is a contract based on outcomes within the existing provider-government relationship, sort of within the system, so to speak? What does that mean? I expect that it's also going to ask a lot of the provider, but what it asks of the provider is that they are supported, empowered, educated to be able to come to the table as an equal partner. Because I don't think if you don't come in that way, I think that puts the provider at a great disadvantage in that structure.
Yeah, I would just build on that and say I think there's a lot of value in the individual deals for the people and the organizations that are in them. And that's to be celebrated. I mean, if an organization has gotten to the point where it's got an infrastructure around it and a set of supporters and so forth to be able to pull off executing something as complex and rigorous as a social impact bond transaction, then that's a great asset for those organizations that are at that place and to get the upfront money. So there's value there. But the broader value probably of this effort is to influence the way that systems work. So for government participants, it forces, I think, a elevated sense of using and tracking administrative data, which is important not just for an individual transaction, but can help us do our rigorous performance management more broadly. For an individual deal, there's huge transaction costs. 2 years to do one deal. It's got to be enormous commitment from multiple players. That's not going to happen at scale over and over and over again. We've got to extract what are the principles that are meaningful from those individual transactions and apply them more systemically. So what are those outcomes that more standard, less tailored contracts should pay for? So the intellectual or the learnings that come out of the individual deals are critically important, I think, for system-wide. And I think a lot of people recognize that and are looking for what those extractable lessons are and ways to apply them.
David, I see you nodding. Do you want to build on that?
So I think one of these potential themes of what are the lessons for government work, for the relationship of providers to government, has to be a sort of sense of alignment between resources and expectations of impact. And I think it's especially important for a community-based organization like FAC, as it thinks about the value it adds to work. As we look above, the impact and equity conversation, that involves a mission that involves place, right? And yet there are so many forces that influence place that that FAC and other community organizations are fighting against. And so really major investments need to follow expectations about change so that a group like FAC can build on its relationships, its social capital at the building level, at the block level, and at the neighborhood level to reach folks who otherwise wouldn't have been served by government agencies. But that's a scaling issue that I think the metaphor of or the program of impact investing can inform.
Thanks. So we've talked a lot about social impact investing from the service provider perspective, from the government perspective, from the TA provider. But I do, having a banking background, would love to ask Andy one question, which is, it's always very hard to go to your credit committee and ask for a loan. And
Goldman, not at all.
yeah, and I'm sure Goldman doesn't have to subscribe to all these government, compliance things. So, but I'm wondering, how do you go to credit committee and say, okay, there's no collateral here. We're not talking about traditional credit risks. There aren't conventional covenants. This is actually about outcomes of a nonprofit. What's the reaction?
So certainly interesting taking the first deal to our investment committee, which is made up of senior partners from across Goldman Sachs. They sit on what we call our community investment committee, so they, and we are very lucky in that most of them have been on that investment committee for 3+ years, if not longer than that. So there's a level of longevity, and they understand our business. We've been in business at Goldman for about a dozen years. We've originated, I think, over, I don't know if it's $3.5 billion of investments. I think I may be wrong on that. I'm over $4 billion. See, it keeps me honest. And So they're used to looking at deals where they are complicated, where the public sector is involved, and that there is always some kind of social impact with that. That said, they'd certainly never looked at anything that looked like this before, and it didn't help that people were calling it a social impact bond. We actually tried to call it a social impact loan, and that didn't work. And so what we really had to do was take 2 steps back and say, okay, how do we think about this as an investment, and how do we think about what are the things that drive our repayment? And really, if you step back from the conversations about pay for success, social impact bonds, really what this is a working capital loan against the proceeds of a pay for success or pay for performance contract. That's what it is. So when you step back and look at it from that, you say, okay, well, what are the potential cash flows and what are the risks to those cash flows? Your first risk is impact risk, right? Is there evidence that shows if we do X, if we deliver this intervention, and what I would say from an organization like ROCA, when you talk about the intellectual capital, it's not only documenting the outcomes, it's actually documenting what it is they do. There is something there. It's not just we meet people's needs. This is how we think about community needs. They've really spent 10 years saying, what is our program model, both our approach, and then what do we do every day? So what we have to look at is, if they do that every day, what is the evidence that supports that they will get the outcomes we need that will unleash the revenues based on that pay for performance contract? Typically, we look at a combination, ideally, of published data around things like cognitive behavioral therapy, because that's an important part of their approach, using the ROCA example, but also looking at their operational data and saying, does that data say that if they do X, we will get the outcomes we want, which will generate the cash flows so we get repaid on our loan. The second piece you have to look at is something I talked a little bit about before, which is sort of, will they be able to implement what that intervention is? And I think one of the biggest takeaways that folks would have in the field is implementation is key. And that is the same thing if you are underwriting a small business that does food manufacturing, or if you're underwriting a not-for-profit service provider that serves at-risk youth. Who is their management team? What do they do around professional development? What is their management structure? What is their performance management systems? How much are we asking them to scale? In the case of ROCA, they were scaling up by 35%. We're not talking about scaling by 300%. And really looking at what are the cost structures. Do they have enough money if we make this loan to be able to pay for those services? So really we spend a lot of time on that implementation risk, getting ourselves comfortable that they can actually deliver on what they've said they're going to do, as well as looking at, to the social capital point, by the way, I love that construct. The social capital point is, who else do they have to rely on to be able to do what they do? And do they have the relationships there to be able to do it? So that's in implementation. Final piece we look at is the credit risk of the contract, right? These are longer term contracts than cities and states typically enter into. And so how do we know that if they implement with fidelity at a high quality and we achieve the results, will the Commonwealth of Massachusetts actually pay on the contract, right? That's important. So we view that as the credit risk of the contract. And in the case of Massachusetts, written into their legislation and into the contract is that they put the full faith and credit of Massachusetts behind that contract, which enabled us to get comfortable that there really wasn't that risk, that Massachusetts would not pay if we had hit all our outcomes. Getting back to, so that was really how we approached it with our investment committee. Once we then had to do sort of final documentation of these, we really had to think about what were the right covenants, right? We all know what those are when you're looking at a real estate deal, when it's a tried and true path, or whether it's LIHTC or New Markets Tax Credit. People have figured those out. Well, the truth is, the first time somebody did a New Markets Tax Credit deal, they had to figure out what the covenants were. And so, that's what we've done. I talked a little bit about exit thresholds. We also covenant around what we call core program principles. So Molly and Lily can't wake up one day and decide to throw away the old ROCA model that we spent so much time underwriting and decide that they're going to offer modern dance. They have drafted core program principles, and that is what the funds are used for. And so we've really had to develop a whole series of covenants for these very new transactions.
Thank you. So for the last question, before we do Q&A, and we're going to try to do this like a speed dating thing, everyone gets a minute, is pay for performance the holy grail, is the title, or the pipe dream for neighborhood focus groups pursuing both social impact and social equity? Start with Kristin.
If supported in the right way and invested in the right way, I think it actually absolutely is the Holy Grail, because it actually brings us back to what we are all getting up every day to do, and that is really to improve the lives of the people that we work with and the communities that we serve. If we lose that piece of it, if we don't focus on what that end outcome is and how all of those actors can best be, I will use the word incentivized and organized around that goal, then it's a pipe dream, honestly, it could do more harm than good. But I think that we're all informed enough about what really needs to happen to realize the core values inside what we are seeing demonstrated through these current transactions. It just asks a lot of all of us in terms of how we come together to pull those values up and out and put them into our system in a more meaningful way.
So I would agree, and I would talk about just a couple of ways that I do think these structures can drive social equity, and would agree that it does keep everybody focused on what we all care about, which are the social outcomes. Because at the end of the day, to do one of these transactions, you need to get everybody in the room to agree what is your lofty goal, what is the outcome that you're going to be able to see that you all agree gets as close as you can to that lofty goal, and what is the value on that. A couple key pieces of this that I think are important to not lose sight of is there is incredible value in using government dollars for programs that work, because every day that we fund a program that doesn't work is a dollar not going to helping the communities that we care about, and we all need to hold ourselves accountable for that. And I think these structures can help, because in my experience and 25 plus years in the human service sector and economic and workforce development, one of the hardest things to do is to end a program. So I think that is critical. Another key piece of this is, and this is really hard in these times not to focus on it, is it can't just be about cost savings, right? That can't be the thing that drives us, is that we're going to save money. We have to be willing to say some of these are social goods, and we want government or health insurers to buy those social goods. So I worry when all people want to do is talk about monetizing cost savings. That might be helpful for pricing, but that can't be the end of the story. I also think it's an incredibly important, one of the things that's important in this, and David spoke to this, which is thinking about who the target population is and using these structures to help drive towards serving that target population. So in our transaction in Utah, all the kids who come into preschool are pre-tested. There are only payments made for the kids who essentially score below a very low threshold on that pre-test. What's very cool about that is everybody's financial incentives are aligned to serve more of those hard-to-serve kids. That's the way the deal performs better. And in fact, one of our covenants in that deal is if you're not serving enough high-risk kids, we're going to close down at the end of the school year. So I think that is another piece of it that really drives equity. My final point is, though, not everything is outcome driven. There is some broader social contract that at least some of us believe in that very vulnerable populations, whether it's the elderly or people with significant disabilities, however we choose to define it, sometimes there aren't outcomes you can tie it to. And so there are always going to be natural limits of this approach.
So, Holy Grail or pipe dream, I mean, I think it gets to Kristin's first point. It depends what it is we're talking about and how we're defining it. So if we're saying what Andy's saying, which is we don't have to monetize and there's non-measurable outcomes that are important, much closer to the Holy Grail than if those things are part of what we're talking about. So I would say in terms of the specific notion of paying for performance through a social impact bond or not bond approach, not a Holy Grail, because those other things are so important and are too often not associated with the concept. But if we're talking about, I would wholeheartedly endorse all the principles that we've been talking about paying for what works, finding ways not to pay for those things that don't work as well as those that are working better, focused on target populations that really matter, providing a vehicle of working capital for high-performing nonprofits. And to David's point, also thinking about the return on investment, not necessarily in terms of recouping savings, but understanding sort of the long-term social benefit, and also not just on the absolute basis, but on a relative basis in terms of the range of things that government is supporting. So for all those reasons, we're absolutely on board, but the contracting vehicle, not the Holy Grail.
So maybe I would just pick up on, I think, an implied potential tension between the impact and equity aspects of this, something that I know Michelle and FAC and community groups think about a lot. Groups like MDRC will say it's absolutely important to think about, delivering services that really work. And so in that regard, having groups, more groups informed and committed to that type of model is something that organizations like ours would endorse, and I'm hearing that among the panel. I think that the equity question is an important contrast to think about. It's, I think it's a little bit of a straw man or straw woman to say you can't be working on both impact and equity. Is certainly an equity argument to providing good services to those who most need it. But I wouldn't want community organizations like FAC or others to stop doing the sort of systemic change work that some of this impact service provision can actually inform well. So it can be impactful to keep kids from going back to Rikers. It's also impactful to reform the criminal justice system. And I think the interplay between these two is really a holy grail.
Thank you. So I think we've kept it to the time for the audience to have 15 minutes of questions. What would you like to ask our panelists today?
If you have a question, just raise your hand. I have a microphone. No pressure.
I have a question about, I can talk about. Introduce yourself. I'm Wendy Fleischer from the Change Capital Fund, and I feel lucky to be working with all of you and even the missing panelists in the Change Capital Fund, so thanks. So many of our groups are working upstream of the kinds of outcomes that social impact bonds finance. So if you prevent someone from getting into the criminal justice system or prevent them from dropping out of school, what should we be doing to best demonstrate social benefit there and to document that? That's a challenge for us. And how can we help monetize? How can we monetize those kind of benefits?
So I can give a very positive example of that. Salt Lake County has a very forward-thinking mayor, a guy named Ben McAdams. And when we first started looking at a very high-performing early education program out there, one of the questions and it was really the United Way of Salt Lake and Voices for Utah Children that identified this program and the real sort of opportunity to scale something for high-risk 3- and 4-year-olds in the area. The question when you're coming to it from an investment perspective, it's not all just about having a great program, but somebody actually has to buy the outcomes. And the county doesn't actually bear any of the educational costs. What they do bear are the significant costs of the long-term costs associated with bad outcomes for their young people. And so Ben was willing to say, while we don't save money because kids are on track in kindergarten through 6th grade, we're still willing to use that as an outcome we will pay for, because we believe that if you can keep a kid in school and engaged, which is typically correlated with on track and on grade level, right? If you're feeling successful, you're probably going to stick around. That's going to diminish. That's going to be both of value to Salt Lake County in that well-educated residents are of value to them, but it also will affect their very bad outcome costs around criminal justice that they do pay for. So again, sort of coming back to this, it doesn't have to be that we have to wait for that bad outcome to happen, but I do think part of the power is that dialogue of saying, we know what we're doing as an upstream intervention. What are things that we can see in the near term that we think are good indicators of the long term that is also research-based? There's a ton of research that shows that if kids are on track in kindergarten, they actually do use the criminal justice system less. They actually, as a matter of fact, have less heart attacks, but that's sort of a weird outcome that I've never understood. But again, making those connections to look nearer term, and again, sort of on the theme here, that's not necessarily just so that you can do a social impact bond or pay for performance. That's actually so you can manage your program well.
Absolutely.
You know, it's always interesting where you pick up a story, like where on the line you actually step into the story. And so for our experience in the U.S., we stepped into the story of social impact bonds, and then as it evolved, pay for success and pay for performance, basically coming like in the middle of the recession, coming out of the recession, just coming out of the recession. And so this idea of cost savings around these structures, although always sort of in the mix, became central for us. I mean, it just was, it was the way government was going to pay for things they couldn't pay for anymore. And I want to just offer that, and I've had this conversation with the group that originated this, this construct in the UK, social finance. It wasn't the driving issue for them when they designed this. They designed this because they wanted social services to be focused on prevention and not, you know, at the late and remedial end of the continuum. And so I just offer that to say we have to unfortunately change the dialogue a little bit and refresh what the driving elements of this idea was originally, and I think they actually hold more truth and for a longer period and for us than perhaps why we as a country, I should say, entered it to begin with.
Other questions in the audience? John?
Hi, I'm John Olson from Goldman Sachs. I have a question. I think it's different from Wendy's, at least I hope it is, but it's very similar in that, I mean, it feels like there's some tension in a couple of the themes that we've been picking up on. On one hand, we know that we want to encourage groups to work together and align various programs to be heading in the same direction and, you know, pointing towards the same goals. And we know that underserved neighborhoods and underserved people need a whole range of things, from housing to jobs to transportation to health. And yet when we look at the social impact bonds to date, they seem very specific, right? You're funding one group to provide one intervention to solve one problem. So I'm wondering, you know, if we could explore, you know, what are the possibilities of there when we look at the complexity on one side of all these groups working together on a range of things, and then the kind of the directness of the social impact bond. Is there any resolution there?
So I don't know how that I have the silver bullet about this. I mean, on the one hand, you know, social problems are complex, and interrelated solutions are often the key to tackling them. You know, I think that at MDRC, which evaluates community initiatives, although we're not known for that, I've been less and less of a fan of the word alignment over time, because I think that what that can sometimes produces groups that are sort of working in the same direction, but there's not the functional coordination that can actually provide that seamless array of services that the most needy provide. But that being said, taking a big step back, there are incentives that government has related to community level outcomes. If you talk to economists, their property values rolls up all of the different amenities and services that are provided, and the incentive for government is to raise those property values and to get higher income people into neighborhoods. Community organizations may have a different goal, and community-wide preservation goals, that is to sort of stabilize the housing market and make sure that residents of a variety of incomes can stay there, may require a different set of tools from government, some of which we have already, in terms of financing for preservation at the building level, but may require a different approach to take that to scale at the neighborhood level.
Other questions? Sorry.
I don't have the answer either, but I want to underscore the importance of both questions. I mean, back to Wendy's point too, in terms of upstream. So it's hard to be in a fact event without sort of just acknowledging organizing. And our mayor talks a lot about the need for political organizing to drive systemic change, and has talked about that very specifically around the city's commitment and interest in raising minimum wage, which would have a dramatic effect on poverty rates and will only come with, through political solutions. So that's one. The point of that we're seeing a couple of trends evolving that I think, John, you're pointing to, which is more sophistication around driving towards outcomes and paying for outcomes, and at the same time understanding that issues are complex and multifaceted and require interrelated work. And I think those principles are broadly embraced, but the challenge is still around executing. So, I've been in many meetings internally at the city and with the city and community organizations where there's heated agreement around like breaking down silos and coordinating services better, and how are we gonna, take a human-centered approach to our clients and not a department, focused approach. But then when it says, okay, now what? There's still room for us to go. And so in some ways, that's an opportunity for FAC and others in Change Capital Fund to say, here concretely are ways that we could be doing our work more effectively in this particular place if government did this or that. In the same way that, a social impact bond might say, you ought to pay for this and not that. That same kind of lessons from the high-performing entities like FAC in a place can inform how government interacts with community partners.
I would just add, is this on? Okay. Sorry. It arrived. You may have a different view, or maybe not. That from NFF, I'll put on the other hat of NFF as a financial intermediary and a organization that's been financing nonprofits for 30 plus years. I think part of the answer to the question, John, is that right now risk is being defined within transactions and ultimately on payment terms. Logically so. These are financial transactions. But if you change that conversation to where policy decisions are being made around this in a more, as Matt is having heated agreement conversations about, then the ability to sort of broaden our use, shall we say, of this approach, I do think that changes. There's still risk in it, but I think the view of risk is slightly different. The idea of the social contract comes into play. This, and the overarching policy decisions come into play, and it changes that dynamic in a way that allows for perhaps a broadening of the application.
Okay, I think we are. Okay.
Sorry.
I was told to end it at 3:44, so you've got a minute.
Okay. I think I would add, what I would sort of say is what it comes down to, I think, for us is these structures we think are really good ways to scale interventions that have some track record of working. They are not a solution to every problem facing a city. I may get in deep trouble for saying this, but maybe instead of doing a social impact bond on Rikers, somebody should have just made a policy change and gotten those kids off of Rikers, right? Yes. That's not a social impact bond solution, right? And so we certainly don't believe this is a solution to every problem, but really a way of saying, if we've identified something like they have in Massachusetts that really works for at-risk young men, this is a way to drive towards those positive social outcomes within a broader context of community organizing, raising the minimum wage, which doesn't require a social impact bond to do it, and all of those things that are ideally happening at the same time, so that if that were happening in Massachusetts, those young men are then prepared to enter the workforce, have the soft skills and hard skills they need to take advantage of new minimum wage laws.
That is
My
an
final thought.
inspiring note to end on. So please give the panelists a big round of applause. Thank you to FAC. This was an amazing panel.